it at this point. So that's when all the calculations are done.
So you're working on partial information in determining that. So like if somebody folds, and
Right.
they don't show their cards, you really don't know whether it was
Right.
good.
In that case, I mean, for the most part, we don't really have any data to work off, so we wouldn't really change that value.
Okay.
But at the same time, you know, over time, if this player has consistently been folding every hand, then we can also assume that they're probably a weaker player because they could have a string of bad luck, but chances are they're just being too passive.
Mhm.
And another thing we have is perceived hand strength, which is going to be PHS for the sake of shortening that up. And what that is, it's a value for each opponent player for every round. So basically, in every round, every player gets different cards. So this is the value that stores how strong we think they are this current round. And starts at a neutral value again until we get a better idea of what they have, but it's modified by their PPS. So we're going to feel more of a threat from a stronger player than a weaker player, especially if we think they also have good cards. So we're going to increment that value if a player makes an aggressive move. For instance, if they bet or if they raise after someone previous to them has bet, then we can assume that, oh, they probably have a fairly strong hand, so we're going to increment this value. And we're also going to decrement this value if the player makes a passive move. That includes calling if the bet isn't all that big, and trying to buy the pot. This is kind of iffy, but a lot of times what happens is if you play poker, you'll go through 7 people and everyone will just check. Everyone will just check, and then at the very end, someone there is like, wait a minute, everyone is checking, so they must have no good cards, so I'm gonna bluff and bet here and see if everyone folds, so I can buy the pot. So if they make a move like that, then we're gonna decrement that value. And also, very important, is my own perceived hand strength. And we're gonna take that pre-flop from just a pre-programmed pretty much table of values. We're going to assign set values to each of the starting hands you could have and say, oh, okay, this hand has this value. And the strongest hands you can have are obviously 2 aces, 2 kings, ace king, something like that. And some of the weakest hands you can have are 2-7, 3-8, because neither of those really get you anything good. You could possibly hit a full house, but chances are it's not going to happen. And you have no possibility of getting a straight with either of those hands. So after our community cards, however, we're going to do a little bit more math. We're going to calculate the number of outs. And outs are basically the number of cards, or whichever cards that can come up that help me. So if I'm holding 2 aces, then one of my biggest outs is going to be another ace, which obviously there are 2 more of them if I don't see any more aces. And we're also going to calculate the possible number of better hands. So if looking at the community cards and looking at the cards I have, there are no possible hands that are better than my hand, then we know safely that we're going to win. And now at that point, it's how much are we going to bet. However, normally that's not the case, and there's always going to be a possible, few hands that are going to be better than yours. So we're going to calculate how many of those there are, and we're going to calculate the probability of an opponent having one of those hands. So we're going to go through a quick example here. I don't know if you guys can see those cards, but the community cards there are a 2, jack, and an ace, and my cards are a king and an ace. So right now I have a pair of aces with a king kicker, pretty strong at this point. And say we've played a couple of rounds already and we've gotten some information on our opponents, which are CPU1 and CPU2. And CPU1, we say, okay, this player has made some good choices. Their PPS is +4, assuming it's like. And CPU2, their PPS is going to be -2 because they made some poor decisions and we decided that they're a weaker player. Now, their current hand strength, we have no information about. That's why it's exactly the same as just their player strength score, because we have no idea what they're holding right now. So at this point, we can't really say. And if you look at the number of outs we have, there are more that lead to draw hands, but for the sake of just immediately improving our hand, we can get either the aces, kings, queens, or tens. Any of those would pretty much help us. And possible better hands, if someone is holding 2 aces, 2 jacks, 2 twos, ace jack, ace 2, or jack 2, they have us beat at this point. And the probability of one of the 2 players having that right now, they each have 1.61%. And that's just straight mathematically, but there's an asterisk there because you can't just take that number and say, oh, I can not possibly lose, because if players don't have something, they're bound to not play a hand. So if they're playing it, chances are they have something. But at this point, we decide, okay, we're going to bet, because chances are we have a very strong hand and it's better than our opponents. And basically what's going to happen is this calculation is going to go on every round. And if that probability ever goes over 50%, so if we believe that there's over 50% chance that we are beaten, then that's when we would either try to bluff or fold. And just a couple more considerations I mentioned before. We decided that CPU1 is a better player, and if they're not folding, they probably have a decently strong hand because we bet. So at that point, we can raise that probability by a certain number. We're still doing number tweaking because obviously this isn't something you can just plug in random numbers and come out with a good result. But we've decided that, okay, chances are player 1 has some sort of strong hand and we need to be a little careful. Now CPU2 we decided was a weak player, so even if they're not folding and they call our bet, we're not too worried about them because chances are they're pulling some kind of stupid move and betting with a weak hand. And also there's, like I said earlier when I mentioned outs, there's more ways you can get a better hand. So the number of outs isn't limited to what I wrote there, and that's something we're going to have to consider. So, any questions?
You're playing with a single deck, is that right? Okay.
And I know poker a lot. Is there like an ideal poker bot?
Not that I know of. I mean, PokerBot's, it's one of those things that I think a lot of people have just tried it, and then they've realized that it's not as easy as it seems. I think the most successful ones that aren't like for real education purposes that like people have tried to make money off of, that everyone knows about, have been successful in micro tables, like 1 cent, 2 cent tables. But once you get past that, players are good enough to beat the bot consistently, so it's not all that successful, I'd say.
You guys have read a little bit about Schaefer's work? John Schaefer?
Name rings a bell, but I can't.
Okay, he's been working, he's at the University of Saskatchewan, and he's working on a checker bot. Or I said checkers. He was the guy that developed the checkers program, he's working on a poker bot.
Right.
How good is your bot currently?
Because we haven't had a chance to really tweak the numbers all that much, not very good. The idea is there.
Was like all the calculations you go through and all that, was that mostly kind of the brainchild of you guys, or did you guys get inspiration from existing literature? Kind of how'd you come up with that?
I mean, I think we were all inspired by stuff already, but I know I had like a general idea of how I wanted to do it. Like I always thought, it should be some sort of scaling value, just like how you would, judge an opponent as you play against them. You're gonna have some idea of that. So basically, I just thought, okay, what things do I keep track of when I play poker, and try to implement some sort of that.
Yeah, one thing that's a possible extension of the idea is having different levels of play.
Right.
So you can have it play smartly or poorly.
Yeah, and that's something we wanted to add in the beginning, but like we just haven't had time, so we've
Right.
tried to focus on the ideal one.
Sort of. Other questions?
Oh, is, are the CPUs also, are they just modeling the actual human player, or are they also trying to model each other? Do they share information about each other?
No, each CPU player acts individually, so for all intents and purposes. Another thing I wanted to do, meant like once you got the numbers tweaking out of the way, was just have them learn by playing each other over and over, but we haven't gotten to that level